Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into today's conversation, I want to share a little bit about 2Before, today's presenting sponsor of the podcast. I've worked with 2Before for over 2 years now, and it's really cool to work with partners long-term, and 2Before has been there for me for a long time, and they make an incredible product that I'm always happy to talk to you guys about. Breaking down 2Before for you, if you're unfamiliar, 2Before is made up of blackcurrant powder, and if you're not familiar with blackcurrants, they are antioxidant berries grown in New Zealand, and studies have shown that consuming them regularly improves endurance by increasing blood flow and removing lactic acid, and they also can manage inflammation and kickstart muscle recovery, meaning you can hit your next training session just as strong as you did the previous day. Today, I have a special code for you, the Running Effect 30, which will give you 30% off of your purchase. And I'm really excited to hear the testimonials of you guys trying it out because I firmly believe this stuff works and is a great asset to your training. Without further ado, enjoy my conversation of the podcast today.
I personally would argue, having been around a lot of top runners, that people who have bigger dinner plates almost always have longer careers. And I've now been in the sport for 15 plus years. And even with athletes that I've coached, like you just start to see these trends, like people who skimp at dinner and like don't have like they're not feeling themselves properly. You're kind of operating on borrowed time, in my opinion.
That was Alex Ostberg, the man of the hour, back on the podcast today to break down the last 4 editions of the Rundown by the Running Effect, our state-of-the-art newsletter that really dives into the world of performance training, mindset, philosophy, you name it. If you're listening to this, many of you have not subscribed to the newsletter. Scroll down in the show notes, the first link, and you will find it. Subscribe to it, check it out. I promise you that it will bring you insane amounts of value, and worst case scenario, you just end up unsubscribing if you don't enjoy it, but I'm very confident that you will. Today's conversation, we break down the last 4 editions. We talk really practically, which I enjoyed, about training, fueling, mindset, all sorts of different subjects that you can apply directly into your training, into your life after listening to this conversation. I know you guys are going to enjoy it. I'm going to keep this intro short. Enjoy the wisdom of the man, the myth, the legend, Coach Alex Ostberg. Alex Ostberg, back for another edition. This isn't even a named series at this point. This is just breaking down our newsletter, the Rundown by the Running Effect, the last 4 editions of it. We did this last month, and then this is kind of the second iteration. So I'm excited to be here with you today, breaking down the genius of Alex Ostberg and his writings. How you doing this afternoon?
Oh, it's great. I'm talking to you from Park City this time. My coaching duties have brought me up to altitude for a pre-USA's camp. So have been enjoying some runs up in the mountains, getting some good writing done, and it's been fun to follow the progress of the newsletter and kind of the feedback from all of our readers so far. It's been great.
I'm very transparent about just about everything, for better or for worse. I'm not saying that as a positive per se, but past 1,000 subscribers, which is pretty cool. So a good amount of people are reading, listening. If you are listening to this, truly believe, am I biased? Sure, but I'm very proud of this product. And if you are a runner or someone who is passionate about personal betterment, cannot recommend this newsletter enough. So go subscribe in the show notes. I'm operating off of little sleep, so I'm a little spacey there. But the other thing, I'm keeping it real. The other thing, if you're going to listen to this full episode and hear the concepts broken down, just go subscribe. It's the same thing. So I think you will enjoy reading it and give it a chance. If you don't like it one of these Thursdays, you can always unsubscribe. One of the first of the 4 that we're breaking down today, you titled "The One Formula That Explains Every Breakthrough and Every Burnout." What a hook in the beginning. What do vaccines, saunas, and tempo runs have in common? What do they, Alex?
Right. So, I mean, I'm just trying to keep up with what's in vogue these days, and I know that with all the health influencers out there, there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of talk about both vaccines, saunas, and then tempo runs are just a staple in distance running. The point that I was trying to make is that those 3 things are what are called hormetic stressors, or they operate on the body through a process called hormesis, which in simple terms really is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Basically, if you stress the body in small and deliberate ways, you're actually able to inoculate your body to that stress and actually get a response from it. But if that dose of stress becomes too much, then all of a sudden you either get diminishing returns or it comes with actual health risks. So for instance, right, like too much time in the sauna is no longer adaptive. It doesn't really help your your health and well-being at all. It actually gives you heat exhaustion. Too much exposure to the cold, like, will give you frostbite, and then of course, like, too much exposure to something like sunlight, which is good in small doses, can give you skin cancer. So really, the central thesis of this, and tying it back to exercise, is that with all stressors that you put on the body, of which exercise is a major stressor on the body, it challenges the cardiovascular system, it challenges the metabolic system. The key is that the dose determines the poison. And I feel like a lot of runners over index on the stress they put on their bodies, the miles that they run, the reps that they push in the weight room, but they forget about the other side of the equation. And when I say equation, I reference something in this piece called what was coined the growth equation by Brad Stulberg and Steve Magnus, which is stress plus rest equals growth. And I think we fixate a lot on the stress side of the equation, but we forget that the only training that you can benefit from is the training you can recover from. So without pairing the stress with recovery, you don't get the growth. You most likely are just going to dig yourself in a deeper hole. So I ended up probably over answering that question, but I think when you think about the body as an integrated system, and you think about how you challenge the body and how it gets better, exercise fits very nicely in that paradigm, along with things like saunas, cold plunges, sunlight exposure, things of that nature.
I love the concept of stress plus rest equals growth. I feel like it breaks it down very simply to a runner, to a listener, to someone who wants to get better. And I'm curious for you, just speaking as a coach, as someone who has trained at a very high level, as athletes, as high achievers, we want to do more and more and more. And I think a lot of times it can be very hard to pull ourselves back and to admit, wait, running 5 miles instead of 12 today, I might actually get more fit from. That is very hard. I don't think I ever had that mindset as an athlete, even if I knew it was right. So how can athletes like shift their mindset and perspective? And can you also speak from like a sports physiology perspective of how, yeah, more isn't always better?
Yeah, excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up, because it's such an important concept. I think distance runners have a tendency to believe that hard work solves all problems. If you're feeling great, then the knee-jerk reaction is, okay, let me do more. If you're feeling bad, then oftentimes paradoxically the same response is, okay, let me do more to compensate for lack of fitness. But it's that could actually be doing the exact opposite of what your body needs. I like to ground this in the physiological explanation, because to me it's just so clear. And I would highly recommend just clicking on the link and looking at this on Substack, because I included a couple of diagrams that I think are really informative. I'll try to explain the visual to the best of my ability. After you finish a workout, the body is by definition, it's depleted, it's damaged, and it's dehydrated. Right after the workout, you are no more fit than you were beforehand. You're actually technically less fit in what I would consider to be fitness. Because if you were to go out an hour later, you probably would not be able to perform, or at least give the same kind of output. So what you tend to see is immediately after a workout, you see a little bit of a dip in fitness level, which is the body basically incurring that damage and then responding to it. The beauty is really what happens next. And again, it goes back to this principle of hormesis and how the body responds to stressors. When you challenge the body and you give it time to recover, the body doesn't just get you back to baseline, it actually overcorrects a little bit more. And this process is called supercompensation. So basically, during recovery, the body doesn't only rebuild, it actually fortifies with an extra reserve, because the body says, hey, if this was hard when I did it this time, if I'm ever challenged in the same way, I want to make sure I can cope with that challenge even better. So on that curve that you're imagining, you see this little dip in the beginning, and then you get a super compensation effect where you actually then go back to baseline and exceed your baseline. And that's how fitness is built. The catch really is that adaptation occurs on a clock. So if you were to do a workout and then you're still kind of in that dip of fitness, and then you work out too soon before you get back to baseline, or you overcorrect, essentially what you're doing is you're just digging yourself deeper and deeper into a hole. So I would recommend, if you go into the article and you scroll down towards the bottom, I looked at kind of like what is the appropriate dose and what is the appropriate timing. And I tried to model two different scenarios. One, where there's ideal spacing between workouts, where you're capitalizing on the right time frames between each hard session. And another is when you're doing too much hard work compressed into too short of a time period. And basically what happens is you will gain less fitness because you're not giving that body enough time to rebound and super compensate.
Damn it, Alex. I always think we can fly through these things. And then you say enough that I'm like, oh, this rabbit hole, this rabbit hole, this rabbit hole. First thing, I'm slightly bantering here, but I feel like in high school, I would always nail a workout. Like run a really fast split, run a like PR workout split, whatever it might be, as I was really coming into form. And I'd be like, walk off the track, text someone, text you, be like, oh my gosh, I just gained so much fitness. This isn't true then, at least in that moment.
Well, I should acknowledge that there's obviously like multiple dimensions of adaptation, and if you can nail a workout, like you're going to be feeling mentally pretty good about yourself, and that doesn't count for nothing. That's important. But at the end of the day, like the body and the mind kind of have to be in sync. And even if you feel great, and you're like, I want to hit it again. Like at the end of the day, like the body holds the trump card. Like that, it will determine at the end of the day if you make or break the adaptation process. So I think a big thing is just like learning to know that like the recovery is just as important as the training that comes before it. Because if not, you're just not able to capitalize on that work that you did. So yes, of course, finishing a hard workout, great. You're going to feel excited. You're going to feel enthusiastic. Mentally, it could be a huge confidence booster, but you have to respect the timelines that the body goes through.
I wanted to ask you a question because without revealing trade secrets, Jerry, if you're listening, he's not. Alex hasn't revealed trade secrets to me, but I know Bowerman works out like a good amount during the week. So I was going to ask you a question about that. But then before that question, I wanted to ask you at what point, because we've talked about this in relation to Grant or just other high achievers, you do as much work as you plausibly can within a week while not going over the line. At what point do you think an athlete should even get to the point of thinking that way? Because I think your response could be insightful for a high schooler or even collegiate here. Because I think, yeah, I mean, you would speak to it, but I think Milt doesn't even really go into that territory of like, how much can we fit in this week? Like, I don't, yeah. What's your
Yeah,
thought on that?
I like I mentioned a minute ago, I think there's two guiding questions when you're asking how much should I do and how often. And in addressing like how much you should do in one given session, I really subscribe to the philosophy that you should aim for just manageable challenges. And so there's a for anyone who knows, Jack Daniels was a very famous distance running coach. He wrote a book that a lot of coaches follow. He was quoted in saying um, that all stress must have a purpose, and training should strive for the least amount of stress possible to achieve a given adaptation. You start playing a high stakes game when you're trying to fit in a lot of work with compressing that all into a week. And truthfully, I think that as a younger or more novice runner, you're kind of like a blank slate. You will adapt to a lot, and it doesn't take that much to move the needle. So most people subscribe to like the two workouts plus a long run per week. I think generally speaking, that's correct. But I think it's where you need to have an open and honest conversation with your coach about just communicating with the symptoms that you're feeling on on a week to week basis. If you're able to do those things and every week your workouts are able to get a little bit stronger, you're able to be a little bit faster, there's no lingering soreness, there's no kind of fatigue, no heavy leg feeling, like you can probably push it a little bit further. It's a very individualized calculation for each runner. There are some runners that I know. The reality is that consistency creates more capacity, right? So as you've been in the sport for longer, the amount of stress that you can absorb in a given session just increases. So what pros can do is very different than what high schoolers can do. Or maybe the best high schoolers can do what the pros do in one session, but the recovery deficit that comes afterwards is something that takes more out of them than the pros, just because their stress capacity isn't as much. So I hope that answered your question. It's a little bit tricky because it's so individualized, but I think you have to be very tuned into how your body is feeling, and continually asking yourself that question. And if you're feeling really lousy for a period of time and you've ruled out other common causes of things that make runners feel bad, then you probably should back off a little bit until you start pushing the envelope.
In a word or two, having a lot of younger listeners listening, middle schoolers, high schoolers, should they even be thinking about trying to figure out how much to get out of themselves versus just seeing progress and sticking with progress? We've talked about this more so on the male side compared to the female side because of changes growing up. But like if you're a male, it's nearly impossible not to improve every year unless you're like messing something up.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a 14 to 18-year-old guy, you have a wonderful drug that's called testosterone, which really helps you improve a lot. It's a little bit different for women, as you mentioned. The performance kind of trajectory changes a little bit, but I would just say focusing on consistency, focusing on not what is the most that I can do right now to maximize my performance, but rather what is the most work that I can sustainably do for years over years is probably the better approach. One other nice line that I'm going to steal from the piece is that the body responds well to gentle nudges and not torturous pokes. And you don't need to be chasing constant progression every single session. Like you don't need to test your limits every single time to find the edge. As a young runner, I always think that you should leave that last frontier to be explored on race day because reality is, as a young runner, you're probably racing a lot, and those races, don't neglect the fact that those are also a really important stimulus for adaptation. It's not a workout per se. It's not designed with sets and reps and intervals, but you're getting a lot out of those. So let those carry a lot of the weight as well.
Next edition was titled First Do No Harm, The Art of Defensive Excellence. And I want to read the beginning here and then have you go off of it because I think this was one of my favorite beginnings out of any newsletter you've put out. You said, quote, you start out, when runners win, we usually ask what they did right, but listen closely while they're in the media zone and their answers reveal a deeper truth. I was, quote, healthy. I was, quote, consistent. I stayed injury free. Rarely is the credit given to one breakthrough workout or secret strategy. It's the absence of disaster, the fact that nothing went wrong. In a sport obsessed with optimization, the real edge is often simpler. You don't need to be as extraordinary if you're rarely broken. Great performers don't just chase upside, they eliminate the downside first. You should meet this
Yeah.
writer. He's a good guy.
Thank you. This was probably, I enjoyed writing this one more than any other one so far. This is probably my favorite piece. I probably shouldn't pick favorites, but I did really enjoy this one. This actually came out in the aftermath, and I tied it into the piece of Warren Buffett resigning as the Berkshire Hathaway CEO. And I have done a lot of reading over the past few years. If you listen to the podcast we did on mentorship in the fall, I must have quoted Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett like 20 times because I love the way that they think about the world. I was expecting that if you take like some of the richest men in the world and you look at like what made them successful, it was going to be really, really complicated, like financial modeling. And at the end of the day, if you like look into their work, it's not at all. They were basically like modern day philosophers who obsessed over eliminating the downside risk. And they took really simple ideas and they took them very, very seriously. And I'm going to have to just continue by quoting them a little bit further. There's two that I want to bring up, which I may have said before, but Charlie Munger said once, nobody survived open heart surgery better than the man who didn't need the procedure in the first place. And he also said, it's better to be consistently not stupid than it is to be very intelligent. You don't have to be brilliant, just a little wiser than the other guy on average over a really long period of time. And I think both of those things are so true in the training process itself, right? Like health is really the absence of injury. And a lot of times we try to ask the question, like, what are all these different ways that I can be successful? Give me the morning routine, give me the performance optimization techniques. And I'm like, yeah, that's certainly important. But like, what about thinking about like what's most likely to derail my season? What's most likely to get me off track? And I think few people flip those questions on their head and ask themselves that. And I think if you were to ask those questions and you were to say, what right now is the single point of failure that's going to end my season? That's going to give you a much shorter list, and it's going to give you a much more actionable list of problems that you can actually solve, rather than just like constantly and frenetically chasing like the next best performance optimization strategy, of which there's always going to be another one.
You share the personal story of, running for UNC 2021, preparing for the NCAA track and field championships. You've shared it on the podcast before, and maybe we just leave that vague for, I'm going to just cliffhang people so they go read in the Staying newsletter. If you want to share it, that's okay. But I'm curious to ask you, what would you say for most people are the biggest things that they should be defensive about? Maybe like 3 to 5 things off the top of your head that they can apply into their training, like directly starting tomorrow.
Yeah, 100%. Most distance runners have problems with overuse injuries. And overuse injuries are
Next
they're
newsletter.
not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we'll talk about that next. Actually, I'll save a little bit of the in-depth discussion for that. So I would say overuse injuries, a lot of times illness, and there's some types of illness that you just can't prevent. Like if you're in high school and you're around people who are sick, that's fine. But like it is definitely scientifically proven that the less you're sleeping and the more stressed you are, the more susceptible you are to getting the common cold. They literally have done this study where they took people, had them sleep different amounts of time, and they injected them with the rhinovirus, which is the common cold. And they found that people who were sleeping less were more likely to actually have symptoms manifest in their body. So like that is true. So there are ways
Can I
to
pause you
control
there
these.
real quick?
Yeah.
Who is signing up to be injected with a virus? How much are they paying these people? There's
Yeah, that's a
no
great
amount of
question.
money. No amount of money.
I know. I wonder what the waiver said when they were. Anytime you do a scientific study, you need to get it approved by something called the IRB, which is just like a human rights like protects subjects from like unethical studies, and they also can't pay you that much because the more they pay you, the more like they feel like they're incentivizing you to like do things to your body that maybe you wouldn't otherwise do. So anyway, I don't know, but if anyone's interested, I can send the study over. Yeah, I don't know
Anyways,
anyone who would
continue.
willingly inject themselves with a
Yeah.
virus. Um, I think another big one personally is underfueling, which actually connects very closely with overuse injuries. We'll talk about that in a second. I think the other one is in training, doing too much too soon. So getting overly ambitious, especially at the beginning of the season. Um, and then let's see, those are four. That's probably a good place to start. I'd say
Four straight.
those are the primary drivers of things. Actually, you know what? Another reason you should go read the newsletter is in the newsletter itself. I drew a little thing called a radar chart, which basically looks at like where are your strengths and vulnerabilities plotted against one another. And I drew this little it's a hexagon, and I had like on each point on each axis it was training volume, mental strength, nutrition, sleep, bone health, and soft tissue health. I'd say the one thing that probably isn't fully captured in here is like illness, but that kind of relates to sleep, as I mentioned. So I'd say those are like usually the primary drivers and limiters of performance. And from each of these things, there's downstream consequences, right? Like training volume itself is like the root cause of something that goes wrong, but usually what that manifests in is like overtraining, getting injured, so on and so forth. So that's a good place to start.
One of my favorite parts of this piece was towards the bottom. You write, avoid the bad to protect the good. I love when you get like very practical and it kind of goes off of the practicality tips you were just sharing there. But you write, improvement doesn't always come from doing more. Sometimes it comes from doing less harmful work. Instead of obsessing over getting 11 hours of sleep each night, first focus on avoiding nights when you get 4 hours. Instead of measuring out a recovery smoothie to achieve the perfect carb to protein ratio, you're better off ensuring you don't miss meals due to poor planning. It's the biggest ad at all of Instagram. I love it. Instead of getting a sports massage 3 times a week, avoid running through pain for 3 straight days. Love that one as well.
Yeah. Again, I think sometimes we overcomplicate performance, and it feels like it might be this unending checklist of all these different things that you can do. And at the end of the day, I think there's a few different things that offer what I would consider to be the highest return on effort on where you place your energy. And I write in the piece like everyone knows the saying you're only as strong as your weakest link, but I don't think a lot of people take that seriously. A lot of times they'll like double down on their strengths and they'll kind of ignore their vulnerabilities. But ultimately, if we go back to the beginning, like performer, you don't have to be as extraordinary if you don't break as often or if you don't show up as often. I think performance is really constrained by the first point of failure. And like a chain that's under tension, it doesn't snap where it's the strongest. It always breaks where it's neglected. So I think when you're assessing like your own drivers and limiters of performance, if you find that bottleneck, that one place where the chain is the weakest, always put your effort there because that's gonna give you way more return on your effort than anywhere else. It's like the other example that I use in the piece is like if you have a hose that has a kink in it, a lot of people try to solve problems by just putting more effort into it. And you would do that by cranking the faucet on the hose. But at the end of the day, you should just go to the hose, find the kink, release the obstruction, and then all of a sudden you've solved your problem without having to put more pressure into it. So I think everyone has a kink in their hose somewhere. They have a bottleneck somewhere, and you have to find that and solve that before any other problem.
Final question for you in relation to this piece edition of the rundown. What is a unique practical exercise that athletes can implement specifically, for most athletes reading this, unless you're like one of your athletes or someone competing at USA's, most people are done with their seasons. Most people are starting a cross country training cycle, kind of a base phase. And I think that's one of the best periods to sit down and get really reflective and start to put and implement the habits that are ultimately going to lead you to success in November and December. So what's a good exercise people can go through to maybe, I mean, you tell them, but like sit down and be reflective and think like, yeah, what are those things that by being defensive about will ultimately, give me the highest return, whether it's like you said, avoiding nights of sleep underneath, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, finding that number or whatever that might be.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that one thing that I'm always shocked that a lot of good runners don't do that well is they don't keep a very in-depth training log. Because with all of these things, they're not problems that you solve overnight. They're typically trends that emerge over time. And in one season you may be limited by one thing, but in the next you might be limited by something else. So my recommendation is if you're laying a foundation for the season ahead, I would be really diligent about tracking what you're doing in training, and having an objective component to it. How much did I run? If you're tracking heart rate, steps, vert, whatever, track that. But also, it's so important to have a subjective part of your training log where every day you're going in and you're writing, like, how am I feeling today? Was this harder or easier than expected? Adding a little bit of context is extremely important because at the end of the day, I can guarantee you, if you're thinking back to like the training cycle that you did in June of 2024, you're going to misremember so many of those details if it wasn't written down. And I'm going to write a newsletter in the future about the dangers of copying and pasting your own training because a lot of times our own psychology misleads us. But I would just say that it's a lot easier to identify what's limiting to you and like where trends start to emerge if you have a very if you have thorough documentation of your training. So whether that's a Google sheet or whether it's an Excel sheet or just a journal, a handwritten journal, I would definitely recommend that every runner starts tracking that more closely.
The following week, and we kind of teased this in regards to the conversation around overuse injuries, why your dinner plate might be your best injury prevention tool, what successful runners know about food, fueling, and staying in the game. I'll let you just take this one wherever you want to start with it.
Sure. Yeah, I feel very passionate about this one, for several reasons. One, it hits very close to home. I guess I'll start with a personal story. When I was in high school, I had like two, maybe three, either a stress reaction or stress fracture, that derailed multiple seasons. And it was the most frustrating thing ever. Like it always presented the same way. It was always something that I thought was just like soft tissue soreness. It would get worse. I'd go into the orthopedic doctor who I became good friends with by the end of this whole thing. And I'd get an MRI and it'd be like, sorry, you have bone edema. You're gonna have to take like 6 to 8 weeks off. And it just so viscerally like hurt at the time because I was like, I feel like I'm working hard and I'm doing the right things, and I couldn't quite pinpoint like what is getting in the way here. And I write like, well, so for me, while bone injuries, they always felt unpredictable, I think they're rarely unpreventable. And one thing that I was completely neglecting at the time, if I could have a conversation with my 18-year-old self or 16-year-old self, this is 100% one of the first things I would bring up is it's that your fueling is very, very closely related to your overall health. At the end of the day, the food that you eat provides the raw materials to build your body into what it is. And we just talked about it a minute ago, how exercise itself disrupts the body's balance. It breaks you down. It damages muscle fibers. After a run, you have more breakdown of the bone. Bone is dynamic tissue. You have cells called osteoclasts, which break down the bone, and then osteoblasts, which build bone back up again. And right after a run, you have bone breakdown, you have muscle breakdown, and the things that build you back up, the things that help fortify the body, help that recovery process happen, is the food that you're eating. Specifically, a lot of it is carbohydrate and protein, but fats also play an important role. And so this was a kind of an angle of health that I just completely neglected. And every time I got hurt, it would always be like, well, let's do another biomechanical analysis. Let's try to switch your shoe type and see if that helps. And now I'm just like, well, if you're under fueling and you're exhibiting signs of red S, which we can talk about in a minute, and if you're a female and you don't have your monthly period, or if you're a male and you are in the lowest quartile of testosterone, you have a 5 times higher risk of a bone injury. And those people who exhibit signs of red S, relative energy deficiency in sport, they miss, I think it's something like 20 times as many training days per year, not necessarily due to a bone injury than other ones. So I'm just like, this is the elephant in the room. And like, I just feel like it has to be talked about more often because it's the hidden connection that links, your health to performance to your fueling. And I just feel like it's probably not talked about enough.
Yeah, you have a section in here. You say your body on a budget. What happens when you're in a caloric deficit? The first one is hormonal red flags. You kind of shared the first one there. If you have it up, can you read and go through the ones that follow below, just for people out there who might be experiencing this stuff to identify it?
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe I'll just frame the issue with the metaphor that I write about in the piece, your body on a budget. I think that'd be a nice way to kind of lead into what some of the red flags are. I write in here that like calories. So imagine that your body's on a budget, right? And calories are the currency that your body has to spend. In your body, the life-sustaining organs, the most important ones for just survival, like your heart, your lungs, and your brain, they always get paid first. So energy gets triaged and diverted to those things first. And then only after those needs are met does your body then send resources to the non-essential functions. And for most people, the non-essential, actually for all people, I should say, all of our bodies are very similar in the way they operate. Your reproductive health and your bone health are some of the first things that the body will start to neglect. So if you're consistently in a caloric deficit, so you just don't have enough, that budget is shrinking and shrinking, and you're burning more calories than you're consuming, your body just is going to have to start making trade-offs, and it starts cutting away the non-essentials. And so that's why we see people who are under fueling have way higher rates of bone injuries. That's why you have these hormonal disturbances. That's why you have menstrual cycle disruptions. That's why you have all these things that I described. This used to be called, like 10, 15 years ago, the female athlete triad. Um, which was, I believe it was eating disorders or disordered eating, recurring bone injuries, and menstrual cycle disruptions. And it's since been expanded into relative energy deficiency in sport, otherwise known as RED-S. It really is becoming more of an all-encompassing thing because the science has shown that almost every single bodily system is impacted by underfueling. So just to go through these one by one, I've already talked about hormonal red flags. If you're getting blood work and if you're a guy and your testosterone is low, or if you're a female and your estrogen or your estradiol is low, that's a red flag that you should probably look into. If you have recurrent bone injuries, especially in your sacrum or your femoral neck, those are parts of the body that have a lot of trabecular bone that are really, really sensitive to caloric disruptions. Those are big red flags. I'm not saying that a metatarsal stress reaction or a tibia stress reaction isn't a red flag. It's just if you have a sacral stress fracture, it's like almost always like nutrition is implicated in some way. If you're feeling cold all the time, if you're feeling fatigued all the time, if you're feeling very irritable, these are all symptoms again that like the body is probably low on energy. If you're getting sick very often for unexplained reasons, yet another reason, it's yet another kind of culprit, or another cause, I should say, because your immune system gets suppressed. And then if you feel like you're training really hard but you're not making any progress, it's then that's like another. It's typically another symptom. The thing that's tricky about REDS is it's called a diagnosis of exclusion. So usually there will be primary factors that are ruled out first before someone is diagnosed with it. So this can sometimes be a month-long process before you arrive there. But I think there are certain things that are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. Like if you're starting to realize these things are happening, I just feel like the easy correction that has very little downside is chat with a nutritionist or just take stock of where your nutrition's at, or your overall diet is at, because it's a correctable problem and it's a reversible risk factor.
From a psychological perspective, I think it is a shift for many athletes to think of eating more as better.
Yeah.
And I don't like to put out these broad statements, but if you're a younger athlete, I can almost guarantee you're not eating enough. And I think I would love to chat GPT this or something. If I had faster fingers, I would right now. But I think both genders, genuinely in the sport of running, have pretty heavy like body dysmorphia, and we just live in a culture where like we think that like less is more, and that like being skinnier is better. And even I remember me hearing, and I never really struggled with it, but I remember hearing like Ryan Hall talk about how he would run his best marathons when he was like 5 pounds, what he thought over ideal race weight. And that kind of just went through one ear out the other. So what would you say? Obviously, you're not like a sports psychologist, but in terms of helping athletes, with that mindset shift, because you can hear this all you want, but I think there's a difference between hearing info and being like, yeah, that's probably true, versus hearing info and being like, wow, I actually need to act on that info. I should probably start eating more, whether or not I feel like it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, I should caveat this by saying I'm not a sports psychologist and I'm not an MD. Um, But a couple things I would recommend. One, I think anyone who's interested in this topic or struggling with it should read Lauren Fleshman's book. I think it's called Good for a Girl. I read it 6 or so months ago, which is a really great kind of narrative explanation of some of the struggles that she went through with body dysmorphia, with Red S, although at the time it was called the Female Athlete Triad, and a lot of the performance things that suffered because of it. I think there's a couple things. So the scientific narrative is starting to change a little bit. Not only the scientific, but also the cultural narrative is starting to change. That like leaner is not always better. Leaner is maybe we can't deny the fact that there's physics involved in running. The more mass that you carry, usually the more effort you're going to have to put into it. But there comes a point where you're at your whatever your optimal body weight is, and that's a very hard number to pin down. If you go any lighter than that, you are taking on an extreme amount of risk. And I think there's two things that usually, and I don't mean this to be like fear mongering in any way, but I think there's two things that usually kind of convince people that it's time to change. One is if you just keep getting injured time and time again, at some point in time, people just get fed up with that. And they're like, I would rather be 5 pounds over what I think my race weight is, which is probably your appropriate and healthy weight, and actually be able to race consistently than watch all these championship races from the sideline. That was for me what kicked it into gear. It was just like, yeah, just like give me a plan, I'll follow it. Like if I need to gain a few pounds, that's totally fine. The second thing is that performance also suffers. And I think until recently, the science was mostly focused on like the hormonal disturbances, but now there's actually evidence coming out that if you are under fueling, not only is your body not going to be in an optimal state from a health perspective, but you will not run as fast. And so typically what you see is people who are under fueling, their success is like a flash in the pan. They might be really good for like an early season meet, but like their career longevity and their season longevity is almost non-existent. And so if you want to be someone who's at the top fighting for titles every single time, like it's just something you have to take seriously. And if you were to just like look around, this is a very unscientific anecdote, but I personally would argue, having been around a lot of top runners, that people who have bigger dinner plates almost always have longer careers. And I've now been in the sport for 15 plus years. And even with athletes that I've coached, like you just start to see these trends, like people who skimp at dinner and like don't have like they're not feeling themselves properly. You're kind of operating on borrowed time, in my opinion.
Someone can fact check me on these stats, but did a quick search. Female athletes under fueling / red S risk 30 to 45%, and then body image issues / disordered eating up to 62%, and then male athletes 25 to 36% under fueling / red S risk, and then 33% roughly body image disordered eating, which I don't think we think it's that high. It's pretty crazy. So I appreciate you writing that piece and shedding a lot of light on it and having good practical takeaways. For the sake of time, moving on here. Fourth piece, the precision trap, why you should aim to be generally correct instead of precisely wrong. I'll always review these before they go out, and I admittingly laughed when I read the first part because I've been this guy before. I have been this guy. I believe when you coached me for my marathon, I once did this to hit a 50
You
mile
did.
week.
I remember it.
So take the people through what I did.
Well, I don't remember the exact specifics, but I remember you were trying to hit, I think it was probably some kind of mileage target, 40 miles a week, 50 miles a week, 60 miles a week. I don't remember. But you went out for like a Sunday afternoon double, which was like a 10-minute run.
0. No, it was like 0.09.
Oh, okay, even
It
worse.
was even worse.
Yeah, even worse. You're paying the Strava tax there. But yeah, no, so I guess just backing up for a second. I am always fascinated, and I am the perfect case in point too, because I've been susceptible to these things, of how neurotic distance runners are. A few things that I quote in the piece that are common examples that I've seen: people running circles in the parking lot to hit an even number. And I'm like, the body does not know the difference between 7.96 and 8.0 like miles. Just like you can call the run, and like you don't need to be circling around just to hit a specific target. And then you have these like people who are like, I want to hit a mileage target. I'm going to go out for an unplanned second run. They're like really, really, they have to hit a split, like hit the nail on the head there, or else they're like upset about how the workout goes. And then of course, another thing that I see all the time is like people go into an ice bath and they're like, has to be 10 minutes. I'm like, says who? Like, why is 9 minutes any better? Why isn't 9 minutes better, or 11 minutes better? But it's just like one person one time said that a 10-minute ice bath was perfect. And then of course, like that becomes the gospel for distance runners. So anyway, I think what this implies is that it basically starts to create a belief that adaptation is precise. And the body is like this machine with this binary set of switches where you either hit the target and you adapt, or you miss it and the effort is completely wasted. And I really want to challenge that notion because I think A, it's biologically false, and B, I think it's psychologically harmful, which we can talk about because the body doesn't deal in absolutes. It recognizes a spectrum of stress. And I think the more, and it doesn't necessarily recognize like symmetry or like all these things we impose on it from the outside. I think the more that we cling to needing precision, the more fragile we become both biologically and psychologically. So I just wanted to like put this out there and be like, good enough is probably a bar. Like, don't let the beneficial don't let the optimal get in the way of the beneficial. Because I feel like a lot of people have that wrong. And we can go into any details that you'd like, but that's kind of the general premise of the piece.
Yeah, you've got a great section here that I'll leave vague. I think people should read Perfect Data and Perfect Reality, but I want to go through, and that one gets, pretty hyper specific in the science, which I think is really enjoyable to read. The next one that I think, might be good for you to elaborate on verbally is relying on precision creates more ways for the workout to fail. Can you share the story of you chatting with Coach Milt and the
Yeah,
Garmin example?
yes. Yeah, happy to. So, just a few years ago, a staple workout that UNC will do is doing like long tempo type repeats out on the American Tobacco Trail, sometimes called the ATT. And of course, North Carolina summers are brutal. It's really hot. These workouts can be challenging. So I remember there was one guy, and I actually don't remember specifically who it was, so I would keep him anonymous anyway, but I remember the story, not the name, which is probably for the best. There was one workout that we did, and there was a young guy on the team who had a phenomenal workout. Coach Milt moved him up a group, so he was running with older guys, like more like senior veterans. And he hung tough, like he did the whole workout. Probably
Is
did a
this
little
young
bit.
Parker Wolf?
It was not Parker. It was not Parker. Um, and so he did this, and we were like, man, like you're in a great spot. By any reasonable standard, it was like a huge win. And then I remember talking to Coach Milt the next day because he's like, you won't believe what happened. Like this person who shall remain anonymous, went in their training log and looked at their Garmin app and looked at their heart rate zone distribution and was like, man, like I thought that was a really good session, but turns out it wasn't because I spent way too much time in zone 4, and I thought at that pace I'd be able to run more in zone 3. And Coach Milt was aghast. He was like, this is not actually what he did was he bought 25 Timex Ironman watches that had no GPS and heart rate, and he mandated that the team wear them for the rest of the season because he was so frustrated with technology getting in the way. Which is actually a good prelude for the next newsletter, which I don't think we'll get to today, but talks about that a little more. And so anyway, couple things that I want to talk about. Like this athlete was anchoring his kind of like emotions of the workout to data that I think is both contextually flawed and practically irrelevant. Reason being, a lot of people, if they're pulling data from their Garmin, are relying on off-the-shelf algorithms that may not necessarily represent their physiology. An equation that many people have probably heard is that your max heart rate is 220 minus your age. In broad strokes, that tends to be true, but there's a huge standard deviation on that. So like you could be a 20-year-old person with a max heart rate of 180, or you could be a 20-year-old person with a max heart rate of 210. And a lot of times your zones are calculated based off your max heart rate. And so the first thing I'll say is that a lot of times zones may not necessarily be accurate. And the second thing that I'll say is that we treat zones, and I know zone 2 has been very popularized lately, as if like if you don't hit it just right, the boundaries between zones, we treat them like they're these physiological cliffs. But the reality is that there's a spectrum of adaptation. And if you're 5 beats per minute below where the boundary is of zone 2 and zone 3, or 5 beats per minute above, like the body does not really know the difference. And so I think ultimately, like this person was letting the data determine whether the workout was successful or not, when at the end of the day, by all accounts, subjectively, it was great. And I think that perfectionism, I write in here that it really shrinks your field of vision. When you really grip the small stuff more tightly, the more likely you are to kind of lose sight of what matters. You're more likely to mistake noise for signal. And I think the effort becomes more performative, and you start optimizing for metrics instead of mastery. And the reality is that testing and monitoring in a workout context imply that control matters the most. And all of us know that racing isn't all about control. Racing is controlled chaos, right? Like your goal in a race isn't to hit a specific lactate number or to stay in a certain zone. It's actually your goal in training is to prepare for moments in races where numbers go out the window, right? Where you're really in that uncharted territory. So I think there's value to metrics and I think there's value to tracking some things, but when it starts to determine how you feel about a workout beyond what the subjective data or interpretation would suggest, I think that's where it becomes problematic.
To the UNC story, a story I see all the time in my own personal life that just drove me nuts, Alex, in high school was kids would run easy on their easy runs and then look at their heart rate and they'd be like, my heart rate was high on that. And I would get in these vicious debates with kids over even how accurate a wrist-based heart rate monitor can be. Can you back me up here, maybe for my own personal pride, that if you ran easy and you did the mileage, check the box, who cares if your heart rate says it was high? Or even if it was,
Yeah,
if it felt easy, it was easy.
I think a lot of times we're arguing over small. So I have to admit that like, okay, there's a difference if it's actually recording correctly, which you're right, wrist-based heart rate is notoriously not accurate. Tricep, there's now these tricep straps which are better, but the gold standard really would be a chest strap, which not that many people wear because it's inconvenient. But I mean, there is a difference between 180 and 140. That's a big enough margin that like if it's actually truly that big of a difference, something clearly is wrong.
Who's
But I
running
feel like a
180
lot of
on an
time,
easy run?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So my point is, a lot of times we're debating like 10 beats per minute, like as a difference. And a couple things that people don't usually know off the bat: running in the heat automatically elevates your heart rate. I can go into the physiology of why that is, but you're usually going to be significantly higher heart rate wise. If you're dehydrated, your heart rate's going to be higher. If you're stressed, your heart rate's going to be higher. If you've taken caffeine before a run, your heart rate's going to be higher. So there's all these confounding variables that are almost impossible to control if you're not tracking these things methodically. And so if you're like, yeah, if you're saying that, hey, my heart rate was like too high on an easy run, but you haven't done kind of the digging or you haven't done your due diligence to figure out why that might be, or just like just plucking a number off the app and assuming that that determines whether or not it's a good run or not. Yeah, I think it's contextually very flawed.
One of my favorite quotes in this was you quoting someone, Ramat Sethi, I think is how you say his name. Most people focus on the $3 decision. Can I afford this coffee rather than the $30,000 questions? Am I saving and investing appropriately? What are the $30,000 questions that runners should be asking themselves?
Yeah. So I think that training in the big picture comes down to things that we've already talked about a lot today, actually, which is, am I stressing the body appropriately? Am I giving it enough recovery? Am I determining the right dose of stress? And am I making progress over time? Um, I don't want to say that the rest is details, but if you're focusing on the consistency, appropriate effort, and the recovery, like I think that gets you most of the way there. I say in this piece, right? Like, and I've already quoted this once before, don't let the optimal get in the way of the beneficial. Sometimes the bar should just be, hey, that was good enough, because good enough over a long enough period of time actually ends up stacking into something pretty substantial. Um, and I say that, like, you know, you don't always have to grip the rudder so tightly to steer the ship. Sometimes you can just let it go and trust that you're going in the right direction. If you're training consistently over a long period of time, I say that in this piece that minor errors will get flattened by the freight train of momentum that you've created. And what matters isn't perfection, it's inertia in the right direction. And so I just think de-stressing the whole training process is probably better. But we do live in a world where training is gamified with metrics and wearables and all these things that I talked about. And like that's really like a 21st century invention. And like if you honestly like if you go were to go to E10 Kenya and look at them train, they've got minimal technology. They're running on a dirt track. Like they're sharing rooms with the bunk beds. Like I don't know how much electricity they have there. Like, and they're some of the best runners in the world. And so I think sometimes we overcomplicate the things that we need to be successful.
Alex, in a word or two, final takeaway, practical advice from any of these four additions, any further notes, deductions, calculations, additions,
Yeah.
subtractions, any final words for the listener?
I would caution most runners. I would say don't major in the minor. And I would just say like know what the big movers are, know what the big rocks are that you should move in your running career. And these are the things that I'm going to continually try to write about in each newsletter and put your attention there. solve big problems, not like tiny details. I think A, will make the process more enjoyable. B, you're going to get more out of yourself. And C, hopefully you'll be healthier and faster because of it. So those would probably be my parting words.
Amazing. Guys, you're a fool if you're not subscribed to the rundown. So go do that. It takes probably 30 seconds, give or take. If you go down in the show notes, maybe less. If you type it in your browser, maybe more. Alex, as always, really appreciate it. Excited to break down more. And yeah, because of scheduling stuff and my crazy travel schedule, your crazy travel schedule, there will have been even more newsletters that have came out when this is released. And the fifth one that we're potentially going to review today, I think is one of my favorites. So people out there, there's plenty of more content from Alex, and I highly recommend you check that out in the meantime. I also think it's just like summer's a great time for a newsletter. Read some more, learn some more. Your space is a little more free, open. Go soak up some sun, read Alex Ostberg. The world is good, ladies and gentlemen. Alex, appreciate you, man. Until next time.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.